Existentialism. Existentialism, propounded by Professor Marcel Gabriel and recognized by Professor J.P. Sartre, got acquainted the world that a living creature might be considered accountable for their aspirations and admirations through optional selections for their specific presence in this irrational randomly assumed world. Professor J.P. Sartre declared that existence comes before essence, that is, extracting out of one's everlasting experience through which one recognize oneself while getting in midst of hardships in an endeavor to establish oneself. Professor Søren Kierkegaard believed that through rational argumentative approach one gets mingled with the objective world, and perhaps while facing existential questions, reason lacks in magnitude because a particular individual reasoning have limits. Thus, existentialism rejecting deterministic, quantitative as well as objective analysis. Professor Samuel Existential Geography provided clarification for the biography of landscape which being imagined for reconstructing that particular landscape through sequence occupancy, maintaining that for every landscape there is someone, whether a particular individual or group, that could be held responsible. Professor Albert Camus emphasized that while an individual seeking order encounters with the actual world lacking in order, the absurdity evolves due to mutual incompatibility, but in reality neither individual nor the world may be considered absurd. According to Professor Søren, individual interpretational options and actions limit this absurdity that grants individual freedom. Anything could happen to anyone, recognizing that there is no such consideration whether someone is good or bad, and events are morally selective. Phenomenology. Phenomenology is the study of appearances that instructs the more detailed understanding of the surroundings rather than early descriptive preconception through unconscious awareness as one experiences the life world all across. The subjective intentionally through which a particular event is being recognized depends upon the methodology of experiencing any particular object. The meanings encompassing the particular object to the observer have profound intentionally deep connection at a particular circumstance which is being called as life world by Professor Husserl. This cognitive sensibilities through qualitative inquiry resonates with one's daily life experience. Professor Johann Heinrich Lambert, known for recognizing the terminology which being used by Professor Immanuel Kant. Professor Edward Ralph, Professor David Ley and Professor Annie Buttimer introduced the essence of phenomenology to social geography, declaring that knowledge is attained through that specific particular way out of which the surroundings being experienced, and thus free from absolute objectivity of the world. Professor Schultz considered that already experienced surroundings have subjective approach, therefore observer manages a conscious projected act. This could be understood as keeping retention and reproducing when required, which is called as map consulting. Without this one is doomed for unconscious behavior. Phenomenological geographic space notion developed through the workings of Professor Seaman, Professor Buttimer, Professor Ralph and Professor Tone, who also accomplished the geography phenomenology and study of human nature. Professor Martin Heidegger, believer of existential phenomenology, introduced Dasein, the non-dualistic living individual preoccupied in the surroundings, proposing that human consciousness bearing perceived events is reality having observable objects all across. Professor Heidegger's being in time analyzed his existential phenomenology by professing that a particular observer couldn't be separately maintain isolated view regarding anything conceived. Professor Husserl, through logical investigations, described realist phenomenology having target over mental act of considering actual and ideal object for intuitive structural interpretation. Further, in his synthesis ideas, introduced transcendental phenomenology that eliminate external objects' relation through phenomenological reduction, and thereby considering only general as well as perspective experiences essence. Noesis being consciousness act and nemata as directed phenomena. According to Professor John Pickles, the utmost consideration of phenomenology is to disclose the world as it shows itself before scientific inquiry, as that which is pre-given and pre-supported by the sciences. Functionalism. Functionalism, although being versatile and literal contextual, meaning to different social sciences as for the faith and temptation of mental cognitions determine behavioral outputs through sensory inputs, but in geography utilized for occupations through which social system integrate itself in order to become more than sum of its parts. Professor Jean Brunches followed functional approach in his French geographical contributions. Professor Ratzel's anthropogeography and terrestrial unity concept of Professor Vidal de L'Obliche might be considered functional for their regional interpretational possessions. Darwinian evolutionary physiographic functional roles of each and every species for sustainable ecosystem functioning notion later modified by Professor Durkheim and sociology for social order shared cultural norms and values for their stability and harmony. Cultural landscape structural functioning totality of Professor Sauer is yet another systematic functionalism. Professor Hartshorn's areal differentiation choreographic areal variation regional synthesis considering region as an element complex could be assumed for portraying functionalism. Early radical geography too influenced by functionalism. Professor Robert K. Merton classified human functions in dual characteristics, manifest functions that being clear and intentional and latent functions rather unintentionally implicit. A city known for usual occupational processing of certain kinds could be assumed as displaying manifest function whereas associated social meeting actual or virtual for mutual collaboration through ideas exchange might be called as latent functions. Indirect functionalism believed to be comprised of function, cities inter-regional and intra-regional functions, functional substitutability, culturally distant techniques impacts, goals, spatial pattern generation and diverse complex linkages establishment, pattern maintenance, self-regulation/status quo, landscape morphology for mitigation or decentralization, also known as homeostasis equilibrium, adaptation, system habituation mechanism monotonicity, as in determinism and possibilism, human adaptation to their surroundings and integration, space-occupying groups interest for inter-subsystem interactions and movements. X. Spatio-temporal connections among races and other ethnic groups. Functionalism direct use lies in political geography for spatial consideration for international relations. Stepwise stage initiative from tribal ethnic minorities to nation-state up to global organizational authorities encompassing centripetal forces spatial integrity against centrifugal forces for peace and security. Therefore, functionalism considers world as a cluster of diversified mutually interdependent systems having summative interactions for recurring and expectable regularities encompassing related form and function in order to interpretate these relations for their role in processing continuity as well as integrity of the system. Empiricism. Empiricism claims that knowledge manifests itself through sensory observation. The Vaishshika epistemology approved knowledge could be derived from perception as well as inference. The Samkhya philosophy too maintained that perception, Pratyaksha, inference, Anuman, and reliable testimony being word, Aptavacana, as the valid source of knowledge. External perception evolves through the mutual interaction of worldly figures and basic five senses whereas internal perception from inferential mind. The inference consists of pratina i.e. hypothesis, encompassing notion that could be alternately proven termed as sadhya and object being dependent on that very idea, known as paksha, reason, atu, and examples, drishtanta. Professor John Stuart Mill's empiricism philosophy resonates with the Samkhya ideology remarking that inductive inference obtained through perceptual experience is the valid source of knowledge. However, empiricism in general advocates empirical evidence for idea genesis rather than innate notions. The Charvaka philosophy that only accepted perception being reliable source of knowledge as inferential wisdom is uncertain fits to the modern empiricism. According to Professor Locke, our knowledge about certain objects is a perception of notions whether having mutual conformity or unconformity. Professor Locke asserted that human mind being a tabula rasa blank tablet which got sensual impressions through one's life experience-based imprints. Professor David Hume considered collective sensory experience to be the resultant of accumulated traits through which faithful knowledge evolves rather than mere reason. Professor William James proposed radical empiricism denying universal supernatural analysis for natural phenomena. Professor Peirce considered characteristics of real objects need not require an individual perception recognition claiming that those having rightful experience could easily agree upon. Pragmatism. Pragmatism having full faith in earthly perceivable creatures approves actionable knowledge that are practically viable. The mankind satisfaction-enhancing processes are considered to be true as likely to be fulfilling aspirations through interaction of a particular individual with the society for best possible solution. Ever-changing reality requires experience dominancy for any context-dependent ideology. Professor James coined the term in 1898 and several others philosophers like Professor Dewey, Professor Peirce, Professor Sheeler, Professor Kilpatrick conveyed their opinion along with astonishing Professor Rorty consideration that knowledge could not be conceived as unachievable exact specimen of reality, rather being a continuous discussion among everybody. Professor Fraser introduced pragmatism in geography during 1981. According to him, as human perception vary, actionable characteristics differ in the surroundings. Professor Fraser considered the impact of geographical variations in daily life context for both knowledge synthesis and knowledge performance. The geographical arguments for human geography associations and acceptable practical understanding for differentiational geographical attribute equally vital with usual absent legendary philosophical guidance support evoked requirement for disciplinary ethical and political motive that ought to be unbiased for practitioners' accountability all across. Understanding should be concluded from behavior having roots in experience rather than knowledge. Historical materialism. Historical materialism considered society as being manifested to include the changes through the progressive evolutionary class struggle for factors of production that thereby influence the modes of production which determine the social production relations prevailing at any stage of social transformation from primitive to slave, further slave to feudal into capitalist and finally revolutionized into socialist society being fabricated by dialectical materialism social reforming tool. Notion doesn't influence the mainstream as much as the realistic production scenario being considered as the dynamic one, therefore any vital crucial change among various production parameters determine the economic conditions. According to Professor Karl Marx, the working class, that is proletariat, being exploited by the upper hierarchy, that is bourgeois. However, the proletariat ideology to expand by offspring sizes to increase their wages make them preoccupied, therefore couldn't manage to equate profit up to different forms of distribution among all at par. Men make their history, but they do not make it as they please, they do not make it under self-selected circumstances existing already, giving and transmitting from the past. Realism. Realism argues that objective world of entity exist independent of our perceivable sensory knowledge. Professor Edward Gibson concluded that during Socratic Platonic period, realism being applied against nominalism that manifested the notion as universal, general terms having multi-occurrence traits, or abstract concepts have independent existence. Recently, realism being professed as an alternative opposite to idealism, external world as an illusion created by a mighty or overwhelming mind, notifying that certain real world of objects lies at the rear of one's conforming, according to his perception. Realism distinguishes between the recognition of causal mechanisms of intensive research and empirical regularities identification of extensive research. The former deals with the key initiative that how does something happen, whereas the latter with frequency of occurrence of that very something. Ignoring to such distinction by any human geographical approach, later suggested an anomaly created due to a closed system supposition as well as an open system consideration. Realism preaches that facts announce themselves. A necessary fact is assumed to be true in every possible realms, whereas is a possible fact only in some possible worlds. Professor Gottfried Leibniz introduced these possible worlds that further being more emphasized through David Lewis's modal realism. Possible worlds differ with actual world in content rather kind. Possible worlds are temporarily spatially isolated with each others and thus seldom interact among others. The naive or direct realism is a common-sense perception of the world certifying all objects having composed of matter occupying space and retaining certain properties whose existence could be observable in space-time. The critical realism professes that the objective reality is independent of mind having some sensory observational data exactly resembling external objects, traits and events. Remarkably, objects in critical realism are not being spatial variations rather than causality-inducing events that used to occur in the world which could be understood by structural forces and their respective causal mechanisms. Neorealism considered international structures overwhelming over state performance measures that are being decisive for state survival. Classical realism elaborated state as actors for their strategic goals. Behavioralism. Behavioralism reveals the impact of surroundings on living creatures in the way they perceive their multidimensional environment by inheriting certain spatial decision-making mechanism as they portray their conceived understanding. Professor Carl Sauer's cultural determinism stressed the cultural surrounding significance over human interactional behavior. Professor John Kirtland Wright emphasized the imaginative curiosity in developing perceptual environment and introduced geosophy for studying geography regarding any kind of view. The cognitive processes are behavioral environmental perception that Professor F. P. Gulliver explained as direction finding through maps in 1907, which later being recognized by physicist Professor C. C. Trowbridge's egocentric orientational reference system for location spotting during 1913. Professor William Kirk in 1952 developed a Gestalt theory-based understanding model that accounted perceived surroundings for behavior synthesis rather than objective environment. Professor Kenneth Boulding in 1956 portrayed that human knowledge about surroundings evolved as an image, which being further illustrated by architect Professor Kevin Lynch in his book The Image of the City. The surroundings understanding bearing mental map consists of 5 repetitive characteristics of all around places, that is paths, nodes, edges, landmarks and districts. Professor David Lowenthal in 1961 introduced influential work Geography, Experience and Imagination collaborated environmental psychology with geographic fieldwork behavioral genesis being motivated by Professor J. K. Wright's notion that people used to reside in narrowed provincial parochial worlds of cultural conservative custom guidance accompanied by some sorts of choice-based acceptance from the outer realms. Professor Peter Gould simulated African farmers on certain cultivational traits through game theory motivation in 1963, which modified the spatial analysis view regarding farming know-how and possible rational economic opportunities. Professor Julian Wolpert in 1964 carried out a Swedish farming decision-making analysis for potential yields that shown Professor Simon Coyne's satisficing behavior. Professor Thomas Saarinen used thematic apperception test in 1966 for drought-prone Great Plains analysis recognized experience-based biased perception behavior. Professor Alan Pratt industrial locational analysis in 1967, conveyed a satisficing behavior. In 1971, Professor Brian Goody demonstrated perception of the environment in his egocentric spatial hierarchy of perceived spaces. The hierarchical core consisted of personal space as well as intimately familiar places. Thereafter, persistent visiting places of varying frequency up to distant places. Far places recognition could be based on externally notified different feedbacks and spatial distance might be fabricated personally. Professor J. R. Gould in 1980 introduced an introduction to behavioral geography that included a schematic framework for individual spatial cognition and behavior. The images and spatial schemata are cognitive behavioral mediators. The images are symbolic mental perceptual thought-based fabrication gained through prolonged observations. These images are remembrance of the surroundings whenever direct sensory observations are being recalled. The spatial schemata are frameworks within which one could assemble his understanding of surroundings consisting of both past and present informational experiences. The personal traits, surroundings customs as well as cognitive processes determine these images and spatial schemata. The information and decision filter inputs affect the information outputs. The feedback loops generate impulse at different categories to signify perception learning, ascertain meanings for understanding for future behavioral mending tactics. Radicalism. Radicalism movement started in the 70s through the effort of Professor Richard Peat conveyed a radical socio-economic political environmental activism. Radicalist motto remained not mere in explaining the happenings of the surroundings, rather formulated solution to the mainstream problems for a revolutionary change. Regional inequality exists due to capitalist mode of production that induces class struggle for social amenities. Radicalism evolved against quantitative revolution and positivism for transforming geography as a locational analysis fabricating spatial science. The Vietnam War, American blacks' civil rights issues and urban ghettos turmoil conditions were the political reasons for considering radicalism in professional journals. A radicalist journal of geography Antipode started in 1969 belonging to Clark University, Worcester. The journal articles emphasized over the gender discrimination, deprivation, exploitation, environmental degradation, crime, permissiveness, health and livelihood prospects. The third world countries' poverty, malnutrition, unemployment and resource misuse kind of problems to address through these publications. The radicalists opposed racism, imperialism, national chauvinism and central bureaucracies. Radical is being criticized for the Marxist-communist ideology as the main follower. The mightier nation too in late 90s introduced capitalist kind of reforms, observing their opponent nation racing ahead of them. Humanism. Humanism in philosophy, introduced during 1808, evolved through 15th-century Italian terminology humanista, meaning a classical literature enthusiast. Humanism values human consciousness while addressing spatial differentiational mutual interconnections, relying over the human creativity which requires human awareness in order to act as a human agency. Professor U. Phytone developed uniqueness of a particular place notion in humanism during 1976 and termed topophilia as love for a particular region. The study of space, from the humanistic perspective, is thus the study of people's spatial feeling and ideas in the stream of experience. Professor Tone 5 themes in human geography are being, geographical knowledge, territory and place, crowding and privacy, livelihood and economics, religion. Feminism. Agoraphobic being considered since long, feminism geography has changed quite drastically. Professor Gillian Rose, known for feminism and geography, stressed that approach of geography is masculinistic. The white heterosexual marginalization of female subjects categorization might be the inducing factors for such a distinctive initiative. The feministic recognition is critical for biased geographical concepts fabrication due to opportunities deprived as well as suppressive conditions faced by the opposite gender. The organizational feministic stigma and their processes of providing spaces for feminism to impart geographical knowledge either orally or inscribed has been the issues historically. However, still practiced in some underdeveloped or oppressive state. The situating knowledge advocates impartial analysis free of any contextual parameters. The universal criteria is the utmost form of legitimate knowledge which curtains individual researchers' identity of whatsoever previous experiences, keeping aside their emotions or any kind of values-bound precognition. Feminist geography wishes for gender equality for the common good. The gender relations and gender identity makeovers are the main approaches while monitoring the nature of geographic spaces differences. The feministic geography works for the mutual interconnections among holistic subdisciplinary frontier subjects in order to focus for versatile features of everyday's portfolio. Idealism. Idealism conveys ideas fabricate reality. Professor Leonard Guelke suggested human thoughts to be explicated in order to understand the cultural landscape's evolutionary genesis. The rational motives behind human processes considered to be foundational imperative for theory creation. The unique features evolving out of a regional landscape, being discussed as a subject of study, which have made possible distinctive livelihood to inhabitants of a particular regional locality by following certain ideas and values. The power relations that manifest human analysis could be taken into account of human thinking about their situational determination. Professor Immanuel Kant denied mind to be a blank slate propagated by Professor John Locke, rather believed that facilitated with classifications to organize the sense impressions, despite one may not actually reaches out for the noumena, that is, objects in themselves, that induce phenomena, that is, the objects as they resemble to anyone, which one conceive. Transcendental idealism thus, might not deny an objective world beyond one's premises but rather maintain a noumenon that couldn't be easily accessible through one's reasonable limits classifications. Professor Immanuel Kant introductory transcendental idealism convinced knowledge to be limited by one's subjective perception as one could not ascertain things in actual parameters but however contrasted with one's intuition and rather confusing. Critical idealism alternatively opted for terminology. Metaphysical idealism advocates reality to be designed by mind whereas epistemological idealism delimits understanding as perceptions of external things being familiar to mind. Professor R. G. Collingwood considered complete history to be history of human thought. His approach influenced idealism for considering it to be a foundational philosophy for the reason being free from superficial assumptions as well as interpretations that are simple with empirical evidence to distinguish between fiction and non-fiction. The idealism approved Marxist class categorization agenda through which a particular individual understand their position being associated with a particular hierarchical class category. Practical idealism popularized by Mahatma Gandhi deals with moral virtues for political landscape surroundings monotonicity. In fact, Practical idealism suggests a useful midway between political realism that being biased upon states' own cunning interests and political idealism which promotes harmony in world through proper liberal power utilization in order to achieve peace and prosperity all across. Imperialism. Imperialism formed by Latin imperium, which refers to power of commanding a territorial region through colonialization that been a sequential process of explorational ventures, merchant trade, governance deployment and warfare. Professor Hobson's imperialist notion as well as Professor James Blott's geographical models of imperialism conveyed imperialism as white supremacy over non-white for territorial expansion. Professor Kjellen's geopolitics and Professor Ratzel's Lebensraum living space notion provoked for territorial expansion, thereby influencing the urge for foreign land resources control temptation. The cultural reforms through ethnic identification mission being the non-materialistic interest for such a cause. The 500 years of plundering turmoil across the planet by different colonial powers of Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, French, British-like dominating regimes paced capitalism that being considered as a synonym for imperialism in Marxist ideology. Professor Mackinder Heartland notion and Professor Speakman Rimland theory guided land supremacy strategic initiatives. Professor Seversky's air supremacy as well as Professor Mahan's marine dominance ideas contributed for the colonial power imaginative ventures. The imperialistic could be categorized as cultural imperialism, economic imperialism, opportunist imperialism as well as French anti-imperialism resistant within public for imperialism by declaration of Professor Jean Brunches like eminent geographers advocating that third world deprived conditions arose and due to imperialism. Positivism. Positivism propounded by Professor Auguste Comte lays emphasis on scientific observational cause and effect. Professor Comte explained the social evolutional construct through primary stage being theological period of ethnic faith, secondary stage as metaphysical universal humanity rights acceptance and tertiary stage as positive or scientific that believes individual personal rights are more important than rule of a particular entity. Logical positivism of Vienna Circle considered both empiricism and rationalism. The former advocates knowledge derived from necessary careful observation whereas the latter being the deductible innate subjective factual reasoning analysis. Applied geography. Applied geography utilizes the standard recognized theories of geography to solve the real-world problems concerning management of resources, environment degradation, urbanization, plannings, development programs along with the technological impacts assessments, computer-assisted modern research exploration, approved by International Geographical Union Commission on Applied Geography in 1964 following the 1927 meeting objectives. Professor Dudley Stamp's Applied Geography tried to interpret the holistic relationship between human and their surroundings as human ecology through statistical cartographic analysis. Professor Stamp emphasized the geographical study to collect data regarding land utilization and other demographic facts to portray the systematic survey exposure of underlying spatial scenarios objectively. Professor Habermas described major types of applied geographical research as the empirical analytical that forecasts the empirical surroundings through scientific positivism, historical hermeneutic that evaluates intentional ideology of actionable motives witnessing the observational world, realist emancipatory that discloses the realistic descriptions regarding the social surroundings promoting participatory hierarchical structure. Professor Michael Pacione explained successive guidelines for applied geographical approach namely description, explanation, evaluation, prescription, implementation and monitoring. Post-structuralism. Post-structuralism followed the suggestive ideology of structure established through the fabrication of language by interpreting the implications of intellectual construct. To extract meaning from an object being indicated by a text, both the object and system of knowledge that created the object have to be considered. The analytical reasoning is biased upon cultural surroundings of historical sequent occupancy, therefore any structural study could not be trusted as being granted. Even the individuality is constructively dissolving subject by a linguistic social cohesion. Professor Ferdinand de Saussure claimed that interpretation is hidden which is to bring in notice. Language is an establishment that need not necessarily portray social reality. The language being the system of twin signs, the primary element is form, that is sound words which called as signifier, and the secondary element is notion through which form is expressionally linked, known as signified. Professor Jacques Derrida, known for structure, sign and play in the discourse of human sciences, introduced deconstruction that uncover assumptions or contradiction about the binaries like mind/body, positive/negative, literal/metaphorical, etc. Here former term is emphatic over the latter, inferior and therefore unequal binaries that influence our argumentative faith. One ought to analyze a fact inside the realms of that particular fact. Professor Michel Foucault carried out discursive practices associated with knowledge. The social upbringing and cultural norms of a reader and that of an author are decisive while interpreting a particular publication. Professor Roland Barthes's The Death of the Author discuss literary text various meanings whose post-structuralism encouragement being birth of the reader,